Paradox Interactive is a AAA studio and publisher known for its strategy games. City Skylines, Stellaris, Crusader Kings, just to name a few. Now, Paradox recently appointed a deputy CEO, whose name I won't even attempt to butcher because I know that's what'll happen. And he's had a couple of interesting interviews and quotables pertaining to the gaming industry as a whole, but also specifically regarding the turn-based tactics genre and his view on why it just doesn't work or isn't viable. This is particularly interesting because it's coming from a AAA studio that really specializes in the strategy genre. I would love to hear your input in the comments as I quickly break down these articles and give my take, as well as how this affects the future of turn-based tactics and strategy games going forward. Looking at the article, the headline really says it all. XCOM is the one thing that works in tactical games, according to the Paradox executives. As you know, it's been almost a decade since the release of XCOM 2, and it's still going strong, pulling impressive amounts of players, even higher than a lot of recent games, even though it hasn't technically been updated by Firaxis in years. This is something that the Paradox executive mentions as they talk about the player counts and show the exact player counts for XCOM, which has 133,000 peak, compared to much more recent games like Gears Tactics, which only ever peaked at 7,300, and Battletech, which is also a Paradox release, which peaked at just under 36,000, but has almost a 2,000 player 24-hour peak. He goes on to say that XCOM seems to be, at least to them, the one thing in tactical that works. Very few other things seem to be doing well there, and so from a business perspective, their thought was, is there a viable second or third place that you can have in this genre that's sustainable and able to be successful in the shadow of XCOM? And simply put, his answer to that question is no, because this was apparently their thought process with the LampLighters League, a turn-based tactics game that was released by Paradox in October of 2023 that only ever peaked at a concurrent player count of less than 1,000 and was written off as a failure by Paradox a week after it launched. On the surface, this is a good argument and it makes sense, but the LampLighters League situation is a lot more complex than it appears on the surface, so let's talk about that. The LampLighters League was announced in March 2023 and released in October of the same year. It was developed by Harebrained Schemes, a developer that is no slouch in the turn-based tactics genre, with titles like the Shadowrun trilogy and the previously mentioned Battletech under their belt, so this was not a new studio by any means. Now, I don't know how much marketing was done, but I can tell you that I never once heard of this game. It's kind of like an Indiana Jones meets XCOM with stealth infiltration mechanics that are mixed with turn-based tactics, which is an interesting and unique theme, but if you're looking for the mass market appeal, the Pulp Fiction style really isn't that. However, these are just small things that are able to be overcome, but in July of 2023, only 3 months before the release of this game, around 80% of the Harebrained Schemes studio was laid off from Paradox, while LampLighters League was in the final stages of development leading up to launch. And who's to say if that particular situation is to blame, but when the LampLighters League launched, it had tons of issues. Lots of crashing, freezing, and performance issues, tons of bugs, and problems with saved games being deleted or corrupted when these things would happen. Throw in a cool $50 price tag, no mod support, multiplayer, or character customization, along with Paradox officially declaring the game a loss less than a week after release, and ending support for it while cutting ties with Harebrained Schemes 3 months later. I mean, it's really just a big mess, and there was not one piece of positive anything in that would make you think that this game had any shot at ever being commercially viable, much less being sustainable and competing against XCOM in any way. Another comparison used by the Paradox CEO is their release of Millennia, which is a 4X strategy game that they intended to compete directly with Civilization. Although Millennia was also a bit of a disappointment, had its own issues at launch, not even receiving a normal full multiplayer mode until months and months after it was launched. These things tie directly into a second article about the deputy CEO and some of his comments about how players are now less accepting that games will be fixed, which we should be, by the way. The broken game epidemic over the last couple of years is a little ridiculous. He goes on to say that, in all transparency, we see that fans right now have a tight budget for games and have higher expectations, which makes them less accepting that you'll fix things over time. And while this article was more talking about the reception to City Skylines 2, which also had tons of issues, bugs, and performance problems at launch, these same statements can apply to the other Paradox releases like LampLighters League and Millennia, which they seem to feel should have been more successful or at least given more of a shot by players, despite all of the launch problems and in LampLighters League case, game-breaking bugs that it was released with. It's almost like releasing a broken and half-baked game in a smaller niche, which naturally is going to have tighter competition for less players, is a bad idea. But to bring this all home, unfortunately, I feel like a lot of these same sentiments are shared by most of the AAA industry. The LampLighters League was written off at a loss of $22.8 million roughly and had a $30 million production cost. And in my opinion, this is the real problem facing AAA studios. It's the same issue Hollywood is having. When you have $400 million budget games like Concord or outlandish budgets for movies that end up flopping, these studios are currently in a state where one bad game will just completely bankrupt you, with the expectation of immediate profitability hanging over their head. And this is without even getting into the whole after-sale DLC model that most AAA developers seem to be adopting, something Paradox is known for. And when they say sustainable, that or live service is what I tend to think they mean. But what is does this all mean for the future of turn-based tactics games? Are they dead? Honestly, I think that this and some of the smaller genres are going to just be abandoned by AAAs simply because they're pricing themselves out of the market. Turn-based tactics games just don't have the same size audience as a Call of Duty or a Madden with hundreds of millions of players to get for live service or push DLC to, where even if the game is broken or bad, you still sold millions of units.
Money is money.
In reality though, this is something that's actually a good thing for these smaller genres, and I'll tell you why. I play AAA games. I'm not going to say that all AAA studios are garbage, but they have mostly abandoned creativity and originality in favor of mostly safe or repetitive formulas and $70 games that include monetization, rushed releases, or some form of trying to keep players on the hook. Turn-based tactics and strategy is one of the best counterexamples to this, as it's honestly one of the most creative and varied genres that I can think of. There's so many different iterations, themes, styles, and blends, from massive RPGs to deck builders and roguelike mashups. I feel like the argument could be made that the turn-based tactics genre is more alive and healthier than it's ever been. There are so many promising AA and indie games on the horizon whose price tags are going to be nowhere near $70 to $100. But if you don't believe me, let me show you. Check out the video on screen now to see a ton of upcoming turn-based tactics games that'll be releasing soon.